I used to think that the people who said I never saw it coming were either lying or not paying close enough attention. I used to think that love, real love, the kind that reorganizes your entire life, was something you could see approaching from a distance. Like a storm on a flat horizon, like headlights on a country road at night. I thought if you were smart enough, careful enough, self-aware enough, you'd have time to prepare, time to decide. Time to step out of the way, if stepping out of the way was what you needed to do. I was 51 years old before I understood how completely wrong I had been. But let me start where it actually started, which was not in my kitchen, though that's where everything became undeniable. It started 3 years earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when my daughter Becca called me from college to tell me that her friend Nora's mother had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, and could I please reach out, because Nora was devastated and didn't have a lot of family nearby. And you know how you are, Mom, you're good at this, you always know what to say. I remember standing at my kitchen counter when she said that. I remember the particular grey of the October light coming through the window above the sink. I was 47 years old. I had been divorced for 2 years. I was still, in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself, trying to figure out who I was when I wasn't someone's wife. I sent a text, something simple, something careful. I said, Nora told me about your diagnosis. I know we don't know each other well, but Becca asked me to reach out, and I just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you. If you ever need anything, rides to appointments, someone to sit with, groceries, please don't hesitate. I mean that. Her name was Diane. She replied 4 hours later with, that is genuinely one of the kindest texts I have ever received from someone I've technically only met twice. Thank you, Carol. I may take you up on that. She did take me up on it. That was the beginning of everything. I need to tell you who I was before Diane, because who I was before matters for understanding what she walked into, and what I walked into, and why neither of us had any real defenses against what happened between us. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, the second of 3 daughters in a family that was loving in a practical Midwestern way, not withholding, not cold, but not particularly fluent in the language of deep feeling either. We didn't talk about what things meant, we talked about what things were. My parents had a solid marriage, not passionate from what I could tell, but solid. They were partners, they were functional. They were kind to each other in the small daily ways that I thought, for a very long time, was what love was supposed to look like. I married David when I was 26. He was 30. He was an engineer, a good man, steady and reliable and genuinely decent in ways that I don't think I appreciated enough when we were together. We had Becca 2 years later. We lived in a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Chicago, and I worked part-time as an interior designer, and we had dinner parties and neighborhood friendships and a golden retriever named Hatch, and from the outside, from the inside too, most of the time, it looked like a life. It felt like a life. What I didn't understand, couldn't have articulated if you'd asked me, was that I had always been slightly outside of it, like there was a thin film of glass between me and my own existence. I functioned beautifully inside that life. I loved my daughter with a ferocity that surprised me. I had good friends. I laughed genuinely and often. But there was something underneath all of it that I had never examined too closely, some quiet, persistent question that I had learned, very early, to simply walk past without answering. David and I separated when Becca was 23. It wasn't dramatic. There was no affair, no catastrophic failure, no single moment of rupture. There was just the slow, honest acknowledgement, his first, then mine, that we had become 2 people who were living politely alongside each other, and that we were both too honest, ultimately, to keep pretending that politeness was enough. We separated with grief and with kindness. We still have dinner together on holidays. He came to Becca's college graduation and sat next to me, and we held hands for a minute during her walk across the stage. I am grateful, every time I think about it, that we managed to end things with so much care. But I was 45 when I moved into my own apartment for the first time in my life. I was 45 and I was alone, and I was surprised to discover that I didn't hate it the way I thought I would. I was surprised to discover that there was something quietly exhilarating about it, about waking up in a space that was entirely mine, about making coffee the way I liked it, about spending a Saturday morning doing absolutely nothing and not feeling guilty about it. I was surprised to discover that the loneliness I felt was different from emptiness, that it had texture and edges, that it was telling me something, if I was willing to sit with it long enough to hear what it was. I wasn't quite willing yet, but I was getting there. The first time I drove Diane to chemotherapy, I didn't know what to expect. I'd offered, she'd accepted with characteristic directness. If you're serious, I have an appointment on the 14th at 9, and I hate driving myself because the waiting room makes me anxious and I end up catastrophizing in the parking lot. And so there I was, pulling up in front of a house in Evanston that I had been inside exactly once before, at a birthday party for one of the girls when they were in high school. She came out before I'd even turned the engine off. She was wearing a dark green coat and carrying a canvas tote bag, and her hair was still there. This would have been her second round, she told me, and she looked somehow both fragile and completely composed. She got into the passenger seat and said, "Carol, I really appreciate this," with a sincerity that wasn't performative or loaded, just clean and direct, and I said, "Of course," and we drove. We talked the whole way. I mean really talked, not the polite, surface-level conversation you have with someone you don't know well, but something else entirely. She told me about her diagnosis, about the particular cruelty of finding the lump yourself in the shower on a Wednesday morning before work, and then spending the next 3 weeks in a strange, suspended state where you know something enormous is happening, but your life hasn't caught up yet. She told me about her ex-husband, Nora's father, who lived in Seattle and was coming back for the surgery, but with whom she had a complicated, distant peace. She told me about her work. She was a landscape architect, had her own small firm, and about how she'd been at a job site the day before her diagnosis appointment and had spent an hour measuring a client's backyard, thinking, what if this is the last summer I design a garden, and then had caught herself and thought, stop it, you don't even know yet, and then had thought, but what if? I talked too, more than I usually did with people I'd just met. I talked about the divorce, about Becca, about the apartment and the strange, unexpected relief of it. I talked about my design work, which I'd been expanding since the separation, taking on bigger projects, discovering that I had more ambition in me than I'd realized. She listened the way some people listen, not waiting for her turn to talk, but actually inside what I was saying, asking questions that showed she'd heard the thing underneath the thing. By the time we got to the cancer center, I realized that an hour had passed, and it had felt like 15 minutes. In the waiting room, she made a joke about the magazines. "Do you think anyone actually reads these?" she whispered, holding up a copy of something from 4 months ago. "Or do they just function as props? Like the presence of a magazine means this is a civilized space where we are simply sitting and waiting, not where we are all quietly terrified." I laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprises you coming out. And she smiled at me with this particular smile she had, a little crooked, a little private, like she was sharing something she didn't share with everyone, and I thought, oh, this person is someone I want to know. That was it, that was the whole thought, clean and simple and not alarming at all. Over the next 6 months, I drove her to most of her treatments. She never asked me to keep doing it, she'd only asked for the once, but I kept offering, and she kept accepting, and somewhere in there we stopped being Nora's mom and Becca's mom and became just Diane and Carol, 2 women in a car, talking about everything. I learned that she had grown up in Cincinnati, the daughter of a structural engineer and a high school art teacher. I learned that she had wanted to be a painter, but had chosen landscape architecture as a compromise between her father's practicality and her mother's aesthetics, and that she had never fully made her peace with that compromise. I learned that she cried exactly once during all of her treatments, in the car, on the way home from her 4th session, quietly, facing the window, and when I said her name she said, "I'm fine, I'm just tired," and I believed her and didn't push, and I think she appreciated that. I learned that she was funny in a way I hadn't expected, dry and sharp and self-deprecating, with a particular skill for pointing out the absurdity in things without ever being mean about it. I learned that she was also, underneath the composure, genuinely frightened in a way she managed with such careful dignity that most people probably never saw it. I saw it. I don't know why she let me see it, but she did. What I didn't acknowledge, for longer than I should have, was what was happening to me during all of this. I looked forward to those drives. I looked forward to them in a way that was different from how I looked forward to other things, more immediate, more physical somehow. A low, warm hum that started in my chest sometime around the evening before and didn't quiet until I saw her come out of her front door. I thought about her between the drives. Not obsessively, not in a way that alarmed me, but in the way you think about someone whose company you genuinely value, a thought drifting through, something she'd said, some moment in the car that I found myself replaying. I told myself this was friendship, deep, genuine, meaningful friendship. I had close female friendships, I knew what they felt like. I told myself this was that, maybe deeper than usual, maybe accelerated by the intensity of the circumstances. Illness has a way of burning through the usual social layers very quickly, but still fundamentally the same thing. I was not lying to myself, exactly, I just wasn't asking the right questions. She finished treatment in April. Her scans came back clear. She called me on a Tuesday evening to tell me, and I burst into tears the moment I heard her voice before she'd even said the words, because I could tell from the sound of her something lighter, something opened, and she laughed not unkindly and said, "I'm okay, Carol, I'm okay," and I said, "I know, and couldn't finish the sentence." We went to dinner to celebrate, just the 2 of us, at a small Italian place in Evanston that she'd been wanting to try for months. We ordered a bottle of wine and too much food, and sat there for nearly 3 hours. She was different that night, or not different, but more fully herself. like a window that had been filmed with winter grime and was now clean, letting all the light through. She talked about her plans, the projects she'd put on hold, a garden restoration in Lake Forest she was excited to get back to, a trip she wanted to take. Portugal, she said. I've wanted to go for 15 years and I keep finding reasons not to. I'm done finding reasons not to. You should go, I said. Come with me, she said, and then laughed as if it were a joke, something easy and offhand, but she was looking at me in a way that made me go very still inside. Maybe I will, I said, and I meant it to sound equally light, equally casual, but something in my voice gave something away, because she looked at me for a moment, just a moment, and then looked down at her wine glass, and there was a silence between us that was different from our usual silences. I drove home that night and sat in my car in my parking garage for 10 minutes without getting out. I sat there and I thought very carefully about that silence, about the look on her face before the silence, about the way my body had responded to it. And for the first time in my adult life, I let myself ask the question I'd been walking past for 30 years. It arrived not like a revelation, but like a recognition, like seeing something that had always been there. I didn't do anything with it for 3 months. I did what I had always done with things I wasn't ready to face. I kept moving. I took on new design projects. I had lunch with my friends from the suburb, women I'd known for 20 years. I called Becca twice a week. I went on a date, a perfectly pleasant dinner with a perfectly pleasant man named Paul whom a friend had set me up with, and sat across from him for 2 hours feeling absolutely nothing, and drove home afterwards with a clarity that frightened me and relieved me at the same time. I saw Diane during those 3 months because we were friends, because it would have been strange and obvious not to, and because the truth was that I couldn't quite stay away. We met for coffee. We walked along the lakefront. She came over to my apartment once and we spent an afternoon rearranging my bookshelves, because she had opinions about organization, and I found her opinions hilarious and secretly correct. I was careful. I was warm but careful. I managed, I think, to seem entirely normal, which took more effort than it ever had with anyone. The thing was, and I understood this only gradually, in pieces, I wasn't afraid of the feeling itself anymore. The feeling had settled into something clear and honest, something that asked to be acknowledged. What I was afraid of was everything around it. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being wrong about myself at 50 years old, of having somehow missed this about myself for 5 decades. I was afraid of losing her friendship if I was wrong or if I wasn't wrong and she didn't feel it. I was afraid of what it meant about my marriage, about David, about the life I'd lived, not because I was ashamed of that life, but because I needed to understand it, to find a frame that made sense of both the life I'd had and the thing I was beginning to understand about myself. I called my older sister, Janet, one night in July. Janet is 3 years older than me and is the person in my family I am most honestly myself with. I told her what I was working through. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then she said, "Carol, how long have you known?" And I said, "I think I've always known. I just didn't have a word for it." She said, "Okay, just that okay, and then, do you love her?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe, I think I could." She said, "Then the only question is what you want to do about it." That was Janet, clean and practical and without drama. I have never been more grateful for her in my life than I was in that moment. It happened on a Saturday in September in my kitchen. Diane had come over to help me finalize a color palette for a client project. She had an extraordinary eye, and I'd started consulting her informally on certain residential projects, which she claimed to enjoy and for which she refused to let me pay her. We'd been working at my kitchen table for about an hour, samples spread everywhere, talking through it, when she got up to pour herself another cup of coffee, and she said, without turning around, in a voice that was very precisely casual, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at me with the expression I knew from the card, direct, a little careful. She said, "That dinner, in April, when I said you should come to Portugal." I waited. My heart was doing something complicated. "Something happened," she said. "In that moment, I felt it and I think you felt it too, and I've been trying to decide for 5 months whether to say that out loud, and I keep deciding not to, and then I keep being unable to actually let it go." She paused. "So, I'm saying it out loud." The room was very quiet. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn somewhere, and I remember that detail with complete precision, the distant, ordinary sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning, which was the soundtrack to the moment my life divided into before and after. I said I felt it. She let out a breath. "Okay," she said, "okay." She looked at me, and then she looked at the floor, and then she looked at me again. "I don't entirely know what I'm doing," she said. I want you to know that. I haven't, this isn't something I have a lot of experience with. Neither do I said. I don't have any, actually. She looked startled. None. None, I said. I've been married to a man for 23 years, and before that, I paused. I walked past a lot of questions I didn't answer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, "What kind of questions?" And I said, "The kind I've been answering for the last year. In the car, at dinner, in every conversation we've had." She put her coffee cup down on the counter. She walked over to the table and sat down across from me, and for a moment we just looked at each other with all of it right there between us, present and real and terrifying. "I have been in love with men," she said. "I've been in love with exactly two, which was my ex-husband and someone before him in my 20s, and I had always thought that was my whole story." She looked at her hands on the table. "I think my story is more complicated than that." "Mine too," I said. "We didn't rush anything. I want to be clear about that because I think when people hear a story like this, two women in their late 40s, a slow discovery, a conversation in a kitchen, they sometimes assume it must have moved quickly, that there's an urgency to late awakenings, a kind of catching up energy. There wasn't. We moved slowly and carefully and with tremendous consideration for each other and for everyone around us. We told the girls. That was the part I'd been most afraid of, and it was also, in the end, one of the most illuminating experiences of my life. We told them separately at first, me to Becca, Diane to Nora, and then the four of us had dinner together a week later. Becca's reaction was complex in the way I'd expected. She needed time, she needed to process. She had questions about what this meant for our family history and for her father and for her understanding of the parents she thought she knew. She was not unkind. She was honest, and we had hard conversations, and over the course of several months she came to a place of genuine, thoughtful support that I don't think she arrived at easily, but that she arrived at with real grace. Nora, to Diane's slightly tearful relief, said, "Mom, I kind of knew. I didn't know I knew, but hearing you say it, yeah, I kind of knew." Then she hugged her mother for a long time and said, "She's wonderful, by the way. You have good taste." I told David. That conversation happened over coffee at the cafe near his apartment, and it was one of the more surreal experiences of my life, telling my ex-husband that I was in love with a woman, that I thought perhaps this had always been part of who I was, that I was sorry for any part of our story that this complicated. He was very quiet while I talked. When I finished, he said, "I don't think this changes anything about what we were. I think we loved each other. I think we built something real." He paused. "I'm glad you know who you are now, Carol. I mean that." I cried all the way home. I still cry a little when I think about it. There are things nobody tells you about coming into yourself late. Nobody tells you about the grief that runs alongside the joy, the grief for the years you spent not quite fully inside your own life, not because anything about those years was false, but because you were living with a kind of low-grade incompleteness, a held breath you didn't know you were holding. Nobody tells you about the way it reorganizes the past. How you look back at your younger self with a tenderness so acute it almost hurts, all that walking past, all those questions not asked, all that very careful not looking. Nobody tells you how strange and beautiful it is to discover something true about yourself at an age when most people assume the discovering is over. I am 51 now. Diane turned 53 last spring. We flew to Lisbon in April, 14 months after that dinner, 11 months after the kitchen, 7 months after she moved some of her things into my apartment, and we began the slow, careful, joyful work of building something new. We stood on a viewpoint above the city at dusk, the Tagus River below us, the whole city lit gold, and she took my hand without saying anything, and I thought, I have never stood anywhere in my life and felt this simply like myself. That's what nobody tells you, not about this specifically, but about any kind of true self-knowledge that arrives late. They don't tell you about the particular quality of relief, the way it feels to stop carrying something you didn't know you were carrying, the way the world looks when you're finally seeing it from inside your own eyes, instead of from behind that thin film of glass. I sometimes think about the version of myself who never called Diane after Becca asked me to, who sent a card instead, or nothing at all, who let the October distance stand. I think about her with tremendous compassion. She was doing her best with what she understood. She was a good mother, a hard worker, a careful friend, a woman who had built a life of genuine value. She just hadn't met Diane yet. I'll say this, I am not someone who believes that everything happens for a reason. I don't think Diane got cancer so that I could drive her to chemo so that we could fall in love. I don't think the universe was arranging things. I think a woman got sick, and another woman responded to her friend's worried phone call, and two people got in a car together and talked honestly, and something that was true about both of them found its way into the daylight. I think that's enough. I think that's more than enough. What I believe, and I believe this with everything I am, is that it is never too late to know yourself. It is never too late to ask the questions you've been walking past. It is never too late to look at your life honestly and ask whether the shape of it fits the shape of you, and if it doesn't, to have the courage to reshape it. I was 47 years old the October Becca called me about Diane's diagnosis. I was 51 the morning I woke up in a hotel room in Lisbon and watched early light come through thin curtains and heard Diane breathing beside me and understood with total clarity that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I spent a long time outside of my own life. I was good at it. I was genuinely, skillfully good at being present in a life that didn't quite fit. And I don't say that to diminish anything, because everything in that life was real. The love for my daughter, the years with David, the friendships, the work, the ordinary Tuesday mornings and the big holiday dinners, and the small accumulated weight of a life honestly lived. But there is a difference between a life honestly lived and a life fully lived. And I know the difference now in a way I didn't know it before. Diane is in the next room as I write this. It's a Saturday morning early, and she's working at the dining room table with her sketching pencils and a site plan for a garden she's designing in Wilmette, and every so often I can hear her make the small sound she makes when she figures something out, this quiet, satisfied exhale, and every single time it happens I feel something warm move through my chest. I am 51 years old. I am more myself than I have ever been in my life. I think about the women who might be reading this, or listening to this, who are living inside a life that fits almost perfectly, that looks like everything it's supposed to look like, that is good and real and full, but in which they have never quite stopped walking past a certain question. I think about them with tremendous love. Ask the question, you have time, whatever age you are, you have time. You might be surprised what's been waiting on the other side of it.